Hello students, welcome to BBA 432 International Business Management. I'm your instructor Mine Doyran for this class. In part 1 of my lecture today, I will be covering chapter 7, specifically discussing governmental influence on trade. What are the likely consequences when the government intervenes in trade? Therefore, in this chapter, we will review the economic and non-economic rationales given for trade protectionism. We will also discuss the major forms of trade controls and trade controls' positive and negative effects on companies' operating decisions. So here are some of the learning objectives for the chapter, starting with the recognizing the conflicting outcomes of trade protectionism and continuing with looking at various economic justifications or the rationales given for trade protectionism, as well as the uncertainties with international trade intervention. We will also discuss the major instruments of trade control to better understand or to gain a better perspective on why the governments try to impose restrictions on international trade. And then we will also look at several responses, how the companies deal with or respond to governmental trade influences. Actually, there is a very interesting case study in chapter 7, which is called the US-Vietnamese catfish dispute. So I would highly recommend you to take a look at that case study. I think it's a great example of attempts, governmental attempts, to protect a national industry against international competition. So the case study talks a little bit about the history of the trade relationships between these countries and look at where the catfish is farmed. Apparently it's farmed in southern United States and Vietnam. So there is also the issue of how Vietnamese has competitive advantage over the United States in the production of catfish, including a more conducive climate, lower governmental restrictions, and the low labor rates. So you want to look at the history, number one, and number two, how Vietnamese gained competitive advantage because of the factors, the unique factors that they have. So even with the transportation costs, Vietnamese exports catfish to the United States. So, and as a result, the United States catfish growers and the farmers in the South fought back using a variety of means. So, for instance, they tried to limit the use of the name catfish and petitioned for increased taxes and quotas on imported fish, and even tried to bring into question the safety of overseas fish in order to protect their own national advantages. So, to make the long story short, this is a very interesting case study of how the US producers haven't been quite successful in limiting imports, and they have even been caught up by their own efforts. So a key point is that trade between the nations cannot be viewed just by one industry. And you also need to look at the other types of imports. For instance, Vietnam apparently is the third largest export market for the US beef, right? It's the third largest export market for the US beef. So if we successfully limit the imports of catfish, will Vietnam retaliate by limiting beef imports? So what the case study indeed shows that it might be misleading to focus on a single commodity only. If we try to limit the quantity of a single import, the exporting country, right, may retaliate by limiting their exports, right? So we might end up losing, even though we may try to fight the foreign producers by imposing quotas on the foreign goods imported. We might end up losing other advantages. So in this chapter, basically, we will be looking at these issues, right? What are the contradictory outcomes of government intervention in international trade? Okay? So starting with the learning objective, which is all about recognizing the conflicting outcomes of trade protectionism. I mean, in principle, no country permits a totally unregulated flow of goods and services across its borders. So likewise, governments may choose to enable the global competitiveness of their own industries and domestic firms. It is very rational to do so. Therefore, we need to look at the term protectionism, right? Which refers to those government restrictions and incentives that are specifically designed to help a country's domestic firms compete with foreign competitors at home and abroad. So the rationale and the justification for such policies can be both economic or non-economic in nature. So we will be looking at those rationales. So whenever the government chooses to impede the flow of imports and encourage the flow of exports, they provide direct and or indirect subsidies for their domestic firms. So basically, overall, if we like to summarize what protectionism means, overall it refers to governmental actions to influence international trade, which refers to protectionism. So despite free trade benefits, governments do intervene in trade to attain economic, but sometimes non-economic, social or political objectives. So therefore, here comes the importance of stakeholders. Who gain, who lose from protectionism? So this is always what you need to think about. Governments, again, intervene most of the time to attain economic objectives, but sometimes, and most of the time, they also serve political interests, social interests, right? So therefore, proposals on trade regulations often spark a very fierce debate among people who believe they will be affected, and those people are known as stakeholders. Stakeholders are those who will benefit or lose from trade regulations. Of course, those most directly affected are the most apt to speak out, such as workers, owners, suppliers, local politicians, whose livelihoods depend on the action taken. That's why it's very, very important to carefully review the economic interests of the stakeholders involved before implementing trade protectionism. Okay. So here are the institutional factors affecting the flow of goods and services, right? So the figure illustrates the variety of factors that can affect trade restrictions, right? So in this case, we talk about the role of the stakeholders, right? The proposals on trade regulations, how it often spark fierce debate about the defenders, and the opponents of trade regulations. There might be a number of reasons country A imposing restrictions on country B imposing restrictions on country A, right? So this might be due to certain cultural values, attitudes, and beliefs. It might be related to political policies and legal practices. It might also be related to economic factors, okay? So you have to look at those two factors in relation to one another. So institutional factors always affect the flow of goods and services. So trade restriction is not a one-way traffic. It is a two-way traffic. Okay? So why do governments intervene in trade? What are the economic rationales for trade restrictions? So here are a number of economic justifications for imposing restrictions on trade. Number one reason is obviously to fight unemployment, to create domestic employment, right? Probably no pressure group is more effective than the unemployed, right? The other group, no other group, in other words, no other group has more time and incentive to protest publicly and contact government representatives. Workers are the first to lose or to gain from any governmental policy, right? Import displaced workers are often the least able to find alternative work, especially if large numbers are concentrated in small company towns where there are virtually few alternative employment opportunities, right? Creating domestic employment by limiting imports, in other words, may not fully work, however, as expected. It may lead to retaliation by other countries, affect large and small economies differently, and reduce import handling jobs. So, in the name of protecting the workers, we might affect the interest of workers working in other industries. So, certain people gain, certain people lose from import restrictions. So, you have to always look at both sides of the debate. Okay? And especially the workers in the import handling jobs will lose from these restrictions. And restrictions may also decrease export jobs because of lower incomes abroad. Okay? So in other words, problems of using trade protectionism to fight unemployment generally, as I said, it may lead to retaliation by other countries. It may decrease jobs in other industries. And now we have the second argument, the infant industry, right? The infant industry is always a very important justification for trade protectionism. So the infant industry argument holds that a government should shield an emerging industry, which is an infant, young industry, from foreign competition by guaranteeing it a large share of the domestic market, right? So the infant industry argument presumes that early operating costs with a newly producing country may be too high to compete in world markets, and that sufficient cost reductions will occur over time as the industry becomes more competitive. Okay? So the third argument is to develop an industrial base. Many of today's emerging economies, as you can appreciate, like South Korea, Southeast Asian countries, and other countries in East Asia, including South Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, right? These economies emulate historical practices and indeed used protectionism to spur local industrialization. So basically, one argument that they made, right, was to spur the local industrialization. Basically, right. So one argument is that, for instance, import restrictions lead to foreign investment inflows, right, which provide jobs in manufacturing. Import restrictions encourage foreign direct investment by firms that want to avoid the loss of a lucrative or potential market. So FDI inflows, in other words, lead to increased local employment by foreign companies. Okay? So this is one argument, right? Investment inflows. And then under this notion of developing an industrial base, we also have the surplus workers, right? Surplus workers, meaning that these type of workers can increase manufacturing output more easily than agricultural output. So basically, developing an industrial base is important because we will create surplus workers in the manufacturing industries. Okay, even though the domestic prices may not be competitive on the world market. So these surplus workers can be more easily be used to increase manufacturing output than an agricultural output. So the purpose here is to shift, right, people out of agriculture and create more jobs in the manufacturing industries by imposing restrictions on imported goods. Okay? So the other argument is the diversification issue. Another justification given for trade protectionism is the diversification issue, right? So the argument here is that the prices and sales of agricultural products and raw materials fluctuate very widely. Therefore, every nation should struggle to create an industrial base because agricultural sector is very unstable. Okay? So basically, it is very, very important to break from the agricultural-led development to industrial or manufacturing-led development. And diversification is the only way to do it. And while diversifying our economy, those diversified industries need to be protected from international competition. And the other reason given, of course, for developing an industrial, the need for developing an industrial base is the growth in manufactured goods, right? The argument, again, the same argument here. The markets for industrial products grow faster than markets for both agricultural and raw material commodities. Okay? And then we will talk a little bit about import substitution and export-led development in other chapters, so I will try to reserve the discussion for another time. Okay? And there is also the argument of economic relationships with other countries, right? So sometimes countries track their own performance as compared to other nations to determine whether to impose trade restrictions as a means of improving their competitive positions. Okay? So one argument, one reason is given for this is the making balance of trade adjustment. Number two is gaining comparable access to foreign markets, right? Number three is using restrictions as a bargaining tool. And number four, controlling prices, especially affecting exporters' prices, are among the reasons given for developing economic relationships with other countries using trade protectionism. Okay, so here is the table here that is summarizing some of the most important rationales or justifications for trade protectionism. This is the issue that we have discussed thus far, or this is a summary of what we discussed. Here are the economic rationales on the left side, and on the right side, the non-economic rationales, including maintaining essential industries, promoting acceptable practices abroad, maintaining extending spheres of influence, or preserving the national culture. Okay? So basically, here, what do we mean by these essential industries, which is also known to be one of the non-economic rationales for trade restrictions, right? Sometimes you will not be surprised to see that the governments may choose to intervene in trade process to justify non-economic reasons, such as the protection of essential industries. What are these essential industries? We can talk about defense, for instance, right? Defense is a number one essential industry. And the other reason is, of course, promoting acceptable practices abroad and so forth and so on. Okay? So the argument here is that every essential industry, if we look at the first one, every essential industry need to be protected because they should not be dependent on foreign supplies, especially during hostile political periods. Okay? So we can be having very hostile, very unstable relationships with other countries due to political reasons, right? So we may decide to impose a restriction, okay, trade restriction on our enemy in the name of maintaining essential industries. But then the problem is that this essential industry may become inefficient over time. So if the government ends up protecting an inefficient industry, it will lead to higher costs and possibly political consequences as well. So let's look at the second argument, promoting acceptable practices abroad, and some of the problems and contradictions of the second argument as well. So government, again, limits exports even to friendly countries, right, of strategic goods that might fall into the hands of potential enemies. So they also limit exports and imports to compel a foreign country to change some objectionable policy or capability. So here the rationale is to weaken the foreign country's economy by decreasing its foreign sales and by limiting its access to needed products, thus coercing it to amend its practices on some of the issues like, for instance, human rights, environmental protection, military activities, and production of harmful products. The third reason of why the government may want to impose trade restrictions is to maintain geopolitical influence, maintain spheres of geopolitical influence, right? Sometimes governments, what they do is they give aid and credits to and encouraging imports from countries, right, that join a political alliance or veto a preferred way within international bodies. So sometimes the US government thinks that if we impose restrictions on other countries, this may coerce them to take certain political actions in return, right? Or punish firms whose governments do not necessarily comply. Okay? The other reason might be preserving a national culture. So to help sustain a collective identity that sets their citizens apart from other nationalities, governments sometimes prohibit exports of and historical items deemed to be part of their national heritage, right? In addition, they can limit imports that might either conflict with or replace their dominant values. Consumers, however, the problem with the last approach is that consumers will always seek out the best products and services for the least price. So no matter what the governments give these justifications to protect their national industries, consumers in the final analysis will always prefer the products and the services that they can afford at the cheapest price possible. Okay? So if we look at the other instruments of trade control, we can start with the trade barriers. Trade barriers starting with a tariff. Tariff barriers obviously directly affect prices, and on the other hand, non-tariff barriers may directly affect either price or quantity. So we have two types, tariffs and non-tariff um, policies or instruments, right? So in the case of a tariff, which is also called a duty, right? Government charge a tariff on a good when it crosses an official boundary, right? So whether it be that of a nation or a group of nations that have agreed to impose a common tariff on goods crossing the boundary of their bloc, okay? So tariff, in other words, is a duty. It's a tax levied on a good shipped internationally. Tariffs may be levied on goods entering, leaving, or passing through a country for protection or to generate revenue, or it can be done on a per unit basis, a value basis. If a tariff is assessed on a per unit basis, right, it's called a specific duty, right? If it is imposed as a percentage of the item's value, if it is imposed as the percentage of the item's value, it's called ad valorem duty, right? So we have a specific duty which is imposed on a per unit basis, right? On the other hand, we have something known as ad valorem duty, which is a percentage of the item's value, okay? So there are other types of tariffs, don't forget. In addition to the duty, we have other types of tariffs called the export tariff, right? Export tariffs are always levied by the country of origin on the exported product. For instance, Argentina tried this option during the financial crisis, right? They were exporting soybeans. So soybean is one of the key sources of income for Argentine economy. And there was indeed, during the Latin American boom, the value of the Argentine export soybean production really skyrocketed. Okay, it skyrocketed. So, but when the financial crisis hit, the government wanted to generate revenue from the export. So what they did, they put a limit on the amount of exports that the country, soybean producers, soybean farmers could export, right? They levied a tariff on the exported product, okay? The purpose here was to obviously promote domestic consumption of soybean, okay? So there is also a transit tariff levied by a country through which goods pass en route to their final destination, right? There is something called import tariff. Import tariff is levied by the country of destination on imported products. For instance, the most recent tariff policy of the United States under Trump administration, right? And I think the Biden administration continued that practice for a while. U.S. government imposed restrictions on Chinese exports, especially the Chinese agricultural products. The U.S. government imposed exports on Chinese fertilizers, right? But what happened was that as a result of the tariff imposed, there was a contradiction, because a tariff increases the delivered price of a product, and at the higher price, the quantity demanded will be less, okay? And also some of the producers here needed the fertilizers imported from China, because those fertilizers were very cheap. So those fertilizers, in order to grow goods on their farm, in order to grow cattle, American farmers needed the fertilizers in order to grow. They needed the products to feed the cattle, to farm the soil. They needed the fertilizer. Okay, they needed the fertilizer to farm the soil, or they needed the feed to feed the cattle. So once a quota was imposed on the imported goods from China, this increased the cost of production among the American farmers. Okay. So there is also a something called the optimum tariff argument, right? Optimum tariff theory basically argues that import tariffs raise the price of the imported goods by placing a tax on them that is not placed on domestic goods. Thereby, this gives an advantage, domestically produced goods, advantage, right? Giving domestically produced goods a relative price advantage over foreign ones. Okay? And also the argument for this is that the tariffs may also serve as a major source of revenue in developing countries. I mean, there is a lot of controversy over the implementation of tariffs. This controversy concerns the treatment of manufactured exports to industrialized nations. So while raw materials frequently enter industrial countries tariff-free, when an ad valorem tariff is applied to manufactured goods, it is generally applied to the total value of the product. So the critics argue that the effective tariff on the manufactured portion, the value-added portion, is always higher than the published tariff. Okay? So, in part 2 of my lecture, I will look at other instruments of trade control, particularly non-tariff barriers. Okay, so far we have looked at tariff barriers. Now the next step is to look at the nature of those non-tariff barriers. And under non-tariff barriers, we have direct price influences. Okay? So therefore, in the next chapter, or part 2 of my lecture, I will describe the major instruments of trade control, again, looking at both sides of the debate. What are the pros and what are the cons of imposing these restrictions on international trade? What are the likelihood of, or what are the major consequences of imposing these restrictions? Thank you for listening to my lecture so far, and I will see you in part 2. Have a good night.